Hello and welcome to Rule of Carnage. This is a YouTube series or a podcast that you are listening to on the topic of designing better miniature games. And we have spoken, on many different topics within this broad challenge of making miniature games. And after a while, we started to forget some of the things that we've said. So we thought we would write them down in a book so that we no longer forget them. And that has the double advantage of offering you the opportunity to delve into some of the things that we have discovered on our digging down into the world of tabletop miniature games design. Now, of course, I'm referring to a new textbook that Glenn and I have written called The Fundamentals of Tabletop Miniature Games Design, a designer's handbook, which is at the time of this video coming out still on pre-order, but only like a couple of days away from being shipped. So you can go over to Routledge's website, CRC Press and Routledge, and you can pre-order this book globally. It will be shipped to you free wherever you are in the world. And I think if you pre-order it now, you might even get it on the day of release because they ship them out early, is what it says on the website. So this is fabulous news for lots of reasons, partly because I can't remember half the things I've learned. So having them written down on a textbook on my desk that I can refer to is fantastic. But for you, gentle listener, whether you are an aspiring miniature games designer, an old hand at designing miniature games, or just someone who really loves playing and reading miniature games and wants to get even more nerdy about how they are made and why they are cool, then I hope that you will find some things in this book that are for you. In the last episode, we talked a bit about how how the book came about, and what the sort of process for writing and collaborating on it was, which you can go watch back on the feed in this channel. But I thought in this episode, we would discuss a little bit more what is in the first section of the book, which is grandly called Miniatures as Medium. And this section of the book is where we allowed ourselves the space to get a bit philosophical about what it is that we make and to get a bit more sort of abstract in creating some frameworks for how to think about designing good miniatures games and what things matter when you are designing miniature games and how to sort of analyze whether the game that you have made is going to be the best that it can be or the best for all the players that might potentially pick it up. So I think, Glenn, what I think is the best way to start here is that at some point, well, quite early on in the definition of the book, we knew that the name for the book was going to be problematic because we've called it The Fundamentals of Tabletop Miniature Games Design, but tabletop miniature game has a bunch of meanings anyway. And so we knew from the start we were going to have to wrestle with this. And I think there came a point in the first year of working on the book where you struck on something kind of profitable as a direction to dig on. Do you want to talk about that?
Yeah, so like right off the bat, calling it tabletop miniatures, right when we went to peer review, one of the comments was, well, tabletop miniatures is sort of a redundant statement because if you've got a miniature, it must be a physical game, so it's going to be on the tabletop rather than on a computer because like you've got tabletop RPGs as opposed to digital RPGs.
Hmm.
And I was saying tabletop not as in not on a computer, but as in not on a board. It's not a board game miniatures game. And it was very quickly obvious that there isn't a useful term or word to describe what these games are. We sometimes call them skirmish games. Well, that's just a word about the scope of the game. We
Yeah.
talk about miniatures games, but we're not talking about boxed miniatures games. Um, and I
Yeah, we're not
think,
talking about Descent or Imperial Assault or, those are
yeah,
those are different and they're built differently and they mean different things.
absolutely. And it is sort of like, part of this is about setting out a thing to say, look, those other games are fine and great, and the digital games are lovely, but they have different design concerns and they have different
Mm.
problems and they do different things. And I definitely believe that having the right terms for ideas is part of how you can think about them effectively. Certainly, how you can communicate with other people in trying to sort of build up a community and a lexicon of talking about them.
And I think that when you try and define the boundaries of something, that creates a limit of where the definition is that you can then go beyond in really interesting ways. So knowing the scope of something allows you to innovate as well, I think.
Absolutely. And so there was a process of going, okay, what are these games not defined by? They're not defined by the scope of a particular game. So skirmish isn't really a useful term.
Yeah, the
I
sort of number of miniatures or models on the table, whatever. Yeah.
Yeah, I don't think they are inherently defined by things like combat and war. So I don't think war game is an inherently useful term.
Yeah, we rejected Wargame fairly early on.
Yeah, because it's like a lot of these games have combat and shooting, but it's not like inherent to the form. And what became, I think, sort of increasingly and swiftly obvious is that what I think is definitional about these games is a sort of a spatial relationship between the miniatures, the terrain, whatever it is that you have on the tabletop. The fact that where these things are in physical space is incredibly foundationally important to a game of this nature. We talk about like in a given board game, it doesn't really matter where on a space you put your marker. It doesn't really matter where you put a lot of the components. The game will pretty much
Right,
just
when I place a worker in a worker placement spot, it doesn't matter if I miss a little bit or it's slightly off center or it
yeah,
falls over.
the game will assume that you got it right, that you did it correctly. And like a lot of sometimes even when you're setting up some of these games, if you put something in the wrong place, the game will continue to assume it was in the right place anyway, and tell you to sort of keep doing things correctly. And it doesn't matter really whether they're here or there. And part
And
of
this
that,
spatial relationship has this other echo of like, it's not just the space, but it's the physical form that the models take as well. And this is why, like, when we bring in terrain from our collection, like it matters to us not just where from a top-down view where the models are, but like whether that building is hollow, whether it has windows in it, like, there's the physical relationships like in all directions. It matters whether the model is here or here because I might be able to see it or not see it.
yeah, absolutely. And that genuine sort of direct spatial relationship that exists in an actual sort of 3D human space, as it were, in a way that other games don't really care about. Other games just abstract those things out. It doesn't matter where I am on a lot of game boards in a way that it does for miniatures games. I think is central to these sorts of games. And so that's where we ended up sort of landing on a definition that's about the I first of all was talking about the sort of the analog space that these things are in, and that's as opposed to like digital being a thing that has to take jumps, and there isn't a sort of you can't be anywhere in the gap in between.
Yeah, whereas like a tape measure itself is like the most analog thing because although it's got little digital markings on it, it's like I can slide my miniature anywhere along it. I can move 2 inches or 2 1/4 or 2 and 16, 30 seconds.
Yeah, I mean analog as in the difference between an analog clock and a digital clock. An
Yeah,
analog clock hand passes through all of the time, and a digital clock doesn't. But obviously, analog and digital in relation to games is often going to be thought of in relation to computer games versus tabletop games. And you can have these games on the computer, so that's not really a useful term. And then we're sort of thinking about the fact that board games are discrete in their nature. You're either in this space or in that space, and these games are non-discrete. And then non-discrete games are a thing in mathematics, so these are non-discrete miniatures games, and that ended up
right.
being the useful term that we landed on to try and like talk about the nature of what is unique about these games, what really defines them, does the weird, interesting, hopefully if you get it right, sort of magical thing of it mattering the physicality of the way you're playing, the way that the models interact with the terrain, the infinite variability of what you can bring into the game.
Well, and I think that for me was the most delightful, almost like pun on this term non-discrete, because the non-discreteness it relates to the fact that I can move a model any number of inches or partial inches or whatever. Like it can exist in this it's not a grid, it's a non-discrete space, but it's not discrete in terms of it tells you what you bring in. It's not like a game of Monopoly where you have exactly these pieces and this number of, bits and bobs. Like it's this open space where I think you sort of caught onto it quite early that like one of the things that we have to do as designers of miniatures games, but we've gotten so habitual about it, it sort of doesn't it's not a conscious choice, is we have to write game systems that allow any object to be placed into the play area and for it to be defined in game terms. So if I take my shoe off and put it into the battlefield, I can sort of point at it and go, looks like an impassable piece of blocking terrain. And like, holy cow, my shoe has meaning in this miniatures game in a way that if I put that shoe in the middle of a game of Magic the Gathering, it has no meaning, it has no purpose. There's no way for that game to describe it. And so, as designers, we've ended up habitually creating this incredibly open source sort of rules engine where literally, like when the cat comes and lays down in the middle of the table, we can have a joke about it. It might be disturbing the game, but we can actually operate with that object in the middle of the field. It still, kind of functions within the operating system of the game. And that non-discreteness of the components mixed with the non-discreteness of the position of the components, I think, as you've said, like that ended up feeling like non-discrete miniatures games. This is what we're talking about. And there are things that we both like designing which sit outside of that space, but this book is going to be about that. That's what it is that we make.
Yeah, a lot of the process of, I think, designing these games is wrestling with that freedom that the players have to be given
Mm-hmm.
and sort of saying, okay, I'm going to have to define anything you bring to the tabletop and give it a weight in game and give it a place in game. And I'm going to have to be sort of clear on how those things work, the ways in which they don't work, the ways in which they do work, the things you can do, the boundaries and the spaces and the areas that allow this thing to keep operating, without me being able to see your terrain collection or the miniatures that you're using or the table
Yeah.
that you're playing on.
Yeah.
And yeah, pinning that down and defining that as being like the task that these games have to deal with and have to make interesting, and the sort of the unique definitional thing about them, I think was quite an important.
And to the earlier point about like knowing the boundaries of this thing allows you to break those boundaries and sort of innovate outside of that. I think one thing is that like just like the broader definition of like what is a game, well, we can all broadly agree that it's not a single definition. It's a set of family traits, and you can have n number of the game like traits, and you're probably a game, but you'll never have all of the same traits as another class of game. um, you know, we have we've each designed and we've each played recently games that I recognize as miniatures games, non-discrete miniatures games, but which have, for example, gridded movement. And so the question is, well, what is it about, a game like, my Flagstone Chess 28 game or, Torch and Shield? What does it bring in that's enough of the non-discrete flavor, enough of the sort of, the openness of list building, the openness of object import, the use of different kinds of miniatures? Like, what concerns is it engaging with from that space, even if it's not actually doing all of the things, it's throwing out discrete measurement for movement or whatever. But that's fine. You don't have to get religious about whether Flagstone counts as a non-discrete miniatures game because it doesn't do all of the things. Like that's not what the book is trying to define and ban certain kind of games. We're just interested about where that boundary lies so that we can explore it and talk about it sensibly.
Yeah, absolutely. Once you can say, okay, this is a thing that these games are interested in, you can say, okay, where can I apply that thing
Mm.
to a game that doesn't generally fit into what many people would think is this kind of classical game? Like you say, you can have that interest within a grid-based game. It doesn't have to actually be inherently about the movement around a tabletop. It can be about, lines of sight. They can be.
I've just had a weird thought. Sorry, this is a tangent, but this sometimes happens during these conversations. One of the most discrete things in miniatures games is the way that wounds and damage are recorded. What
Mm.
if you had a non-discrete damage system, like where you had like a bar and you had to color it in, and you only got like 10, a second to start coloring it in or something. Anyway, non-discrete damage system. Put that down in my little notebook to explore.
Yeah, and yeah, like, and as soon as you start considering these things, and like I say, having the words to talk about them is part of what allows you to think about them. And as soon as you start having these words and addressing these concepts, you can start going, okay, well, if this is what these games are about, where else can I apply it? Where
Mm,
else can I stretch it out? Where can I apply it to a game that doesn't generally have a lot of these terms? Is it's something that's in a resolution system? Is it something that's about line of sight? Is it something about the movement? Is it something about the terrain? All of these things can have this non-discrete element to them. It doesn't have to be, a tape measures and miniatures game to have this as one of its central important, difficult, and interesting concerns.
mm.
And yeah, sort of pinning that down, I think, was one of the sort of the first early parts of being able to understand what we're talking about and how we're talking about it, and where we're going to move on with it.
Yeah, and so one of the next sort of big, for me, ideas in this first section of the book was we talked about it a couple times before on the channel, but this idea that there's something special about um, these kinds of hobby games, and we all, hobby game was one that we considered, but as we've talked about just now, like it isn't necessarily definitional about what these kinds of games are. Although for me, like it very much is definitional of the sort of games that I tend to make, which is that these games that we make and the fact that you can welcome any physical objects, but also that you sort of demand the player to bring their own physical objects in, it creates this step in the gameplay loop that very few other game formats have, and that's this physical preparation.
Mm.
So you've got your mental preparation of having to sort of read the rules and understand what the system is, because before you do that, you're not going to be able to sort of begin the process of preparing to play the game. Now, that's the same with, for example, a tabletop role-playing game. You need to do a fair amount of sort of mental preparation before you can sit down and play that game for the first time. To a degree, there's an element of that with board games, but then um, with these miniatures games, you've got this physical preparation. The miniatures may not be provided or may not be assembled. The terrain may not be provided. The way that you lay out the table is entirely within your hands, and then that leads to the actual experience of playing the game. And then what is very, very common after the game for lots of different games is that you analyze the game and you think about what you'll do differently next time. But in this case, it connects back to, this mental and physical preparation because of, you know, the non-discrete nature or the non-fixed nature of your lists and your forces in many of these games. Like, Magic the Gathering has this same part of like, oh, what will I tweak in my deck for next game? But that's very much, part of this loop is, well, what am I going to tweak for the next game? How will I approach not just the way that I execute my game plan, but also what do I include? And so now I need to think about, some mental preparation of planning that list, statting those things out, maybe going buying some stuff, and then the physical preparation of actually, painting those guys up or building them or whatever. And I think that as a designer, understanding that there is this loop and how to trigger jollies at each one of those stages and make sure that your game does provide jollies all the way around that clock face, like that's an important framework for me.
Mm.
At least it's been a useful framework for thinking about, in some cases I will design a game that deliberately doesn't emphasize one of those things, or as I'm coming up with a design, I'll realize that one of those things is being de-emphasized by the design. And so being aware of that and understanding the trade-off that I'm making, just part of being a kind of a front of mind designer and not accidentally leaving something out, but making a choice to.
Yeah, absolutely. Like game design particularly is quite often about loops, gameplay loops, ways to sort of get your player, running around a set of things and making each of them enjoyable. And each of them is sort of a flywheel that carries its own weight and pushes the
Mm.
player on to the next turn and the next moment. The one more turn of a game like Civilization, those gameplay loops. And yeah, it is maybe not definitional, but largely unique that within these games there's that larger, like, outside of the game session loop that doesn't just involve, like you say, the mental preparation, like a board game. You can play it, you can think a bit about at the end of playing it about how you played, but it's a rare person who's going to go and like practice and rework their strategies. You'll think about the end and then you'll wait until you next time you play the game to
Yeah.
try and remember what you thought. And then you got something like Magic the Gathering, like you say, that has this stage where you go, well, I'm going to go away and I'm going to pull some cards out of my deck and put them back in to like
Yeah, they
react
might
to
even
what
actually
happened.
practice drawing an opening hand and see what that feels like. And
It's deeply unusual to these games. You go, okay, what do I need to change mentally about the way I played? What do I need to change about my list? And now I want to make a change that requires me to get a set of clippers and a miniature. And because this guy needs to have a different sort of heavy weapon, I need to go to my hobby table and I need to clip his hands off and replace it with a new gun. And like,
and I think that this is one of the most magical things when you compare it to digital games, that like so few digital games offer this level of like personal investment into what I'm playing. Like I play a ton of digital games, and I love the experience, and they do things much better, certain things much better than we can ever do in this non-discrete sort of hobby miniatures world. But by golly, you just when you rock up to play the game, you're playing it with your stuff, and there's nothing else that does it in quite the same way.
yeah, and again, creating ways that each of those steps in that larger loop can be, like I say, a flywheel that adds momentum to the
Mm.
player's interest in the game rather than saps energy out of them. I think like people have often been in the place where needing to go back to like buying a new miniature, shelling out money to get a sort of a tabletop advantage is exhausting and draining and sucks people out of the hobby. And trying to be welcoming in that, to say like, this is a thing where you have options, you have choices, and hopefully it's something that's creative for you and you're
Mm.
excited to like go back in there and go like, well, all I really have to do is repaint his face to put him in a different uniform or something. It's a creative thing rather than like a financial
Most of
physical
my
tax
officers
on me.
are identified by their face uniform.
Yeah, well, all right, put some camo on him. I don't know, but like trying to,
This
like I
man's
say,
moustache is not big enough. He needs a leadership bonus.
trying to offer people ways to engage with each of those moments that are going to energize them rather than exhaust them, that they're going to
Yeah.
like put energy into the flywheel of wanting to come back to your game again and again and again.
Mm.
It is an important design choice, and it is something that is like when you're designing a card game or a box game, the product design of the physical things that your player is going to be using is part of the process, but it's not part of a process that's as sort of relation as much of a giving relationship between you and the players, because it's like saying, okay, what things do I need to hand over to them that will make the game flow as easily and be as like satisfying as possible. With these games, it's a way of saying, okay, what offers and suggestions do I make to my players that will make them as excited at every part of that loop to engage with that bit of the loop, so they can be like, I played a game, I've learned some things, great, now I need to go back and I need to like get that guy Kit Bash back together again. Oh, I'm so excited to
Yeah,
try
and I
that.
think that segues really nicely to, I think, probably the third important for me framework that's in this first section of our book, which is this idea that there are multiple sources of fun. So as you're
Mm,
pushing people around that loop, the fact that I am wanting to kit bash a model, that impulse will be driven by probably multiple reasons. And it might be that I want a gameplay advantage, and it might be because I want a gameplay advantage because I feel an intrinsic need to like master this game and figure out the system so that my gameplay is better. It also might be an extrinsic reason that like I want that model to be more effective because I want another chance at having a go, and maybe I'll beat Glenn this time. But it also might be that you're it also might be that you're realizing that there's a story that you want this model to tell. And actually, you thought they were the heavy weapon guy, but for the third game in a row, they've like taken down two guys in close combat because they're the back marker and they keep marking the objective. And actually, do you know what? I think this guy needs a giant axe, and I think it's right that he does get converted because the story is changing for this model, and I'm getting into the narrative of this. I'm getting into the narrative of this. And I've talked about this model for identifying what sources of fun there are on the channel before, but briefly, it is the idea that there is sources of fun which relate to both stuff inside the game world and outside the game world. So diegetic fun, meaning the kind of fantasy that that's existing, the logic inside the game world that's represented on the table, and then the non-diegetic fun, which is kind of, you could kind of call it the meta fun. It's the fun of manipulating the game as the game. It's the physical thing in front of you. It's the real world experience of being a gamer playing this game. And then, as I've suggested in that opening spiel, like there's also intrinsic fun for its own sake, fun because it's fun for me and it doesn't need to be externally motivated or validated. And there's extrinsic, like externally motivated or externally rewarded or externally connected fun. And there's places on all of this plot. And the thing is that it's not that your game needs to be one or other of those things. And it's not that a player is looking for one or other of those things. It's that the more lights on this Christmas tree you light up, the better your game will be doing a job of like meeting the various fun needs of the players that touch it.
Yeah, and I think like again, one of the things I found interesting in like researching around this area is that a lot of the writing that talks about the sort of extrinsic, intrinsic, diegetic, non-diegetic fun implies that like intrinsic diegetic is the best sort of fun that you if your game does that, you're a good designer and it's a good game. And then like the other end of it, the extrinsic non-diegetic fun is in some way like a dirty thing that bad designers use, because if it's extrinsic, it must be you as a designer throwing like sweeties at somebody's head when they do the thing that you've demanded that they do, that isn't sort of part of the game. And
And
I
that's
think,
because of like mobile games sort of perverting this to the nth degree, where it's like, okay, I want you to play my game, so I will offer you freebies if you turn up every day and play for a small amount of time, then you'll get some free gift. And so
yeah,
I feel like I'm maybe not playing the game because I'm excited by the fantasy, or I'm not playing the game because I'm having a social experience. I'm playing the game because the game maker is paying me to do
yeah,
so.
yeah, absolutely. It is sort of a dirty word, I think, sometimes in digital games because of the you sign on because I'm going to give you in-game credits if you do it every single day and you get a run of doing it, which is very much non-diegetic extrinsic rewards. But there are some lovely things down there in the sort of, for these sorts of games, definitely the joy of like hobby and modeling is non-diegetic. Your miniatures have no concept about the fact that they're about to have their head clippered off and replaced with a bullhead or
That's
something.
true, but it can also be wrapped inside the like, oh, but I'm and it's creating the army or the character that I can kind of see in my mind. And so one can be inside the other. They can be in this really happy partnership.
Absolutely. And like, intrinsic rewards within a game are a lovely bit of the flywheel, but all of that social stuff, the thing of rocking up to a table and impressing somebody with like the cool paint job you've done on your
Yeah.
minis is in extrinsic to the game and is one of the loveliest
And
bits.
it's sort of extrinsic to you as well. It's like I would like validation from the outside. Like I'm going to do this because it feels good to have people coo over a thing that I did and get that little dopamine hit. They're like, yeah, I did a thing and people like it. Why
Yeah,
do you
and
think people
absolutely.
share so many miniatures on Instagram?
Yeah, no, no, totally. And it's like having the opportunity to sort of hopefully reclaim that like lower right hand quadrant of that, plot scatter plot to
Yeah,
say like,
wherein also lies the joy of winning and mastering a game so that you can beat people competitively. And I think that this is we this is the best framework I've stumbled across for sort of debunking the competitive narrative nonsensical sort of schism, because a game that delivers on all of these different quadrants can do so with a different kind of EQ. And it can be that this game is better at delivering a kind of outside of the game mastery sort of extrinsic competition between players thing, but it doesn't mean that it doesn't also have great opportunities for story building or for, developing your force in a way that evokes the fantasy of what we're trying, what we see in our mind. And it's just that if you design a game where um, you decide as a designer that one of these quadrants is sort of invalid as a way of playing, or as a pillar of your design, you're like, I don't wish to make a game that's in that way, then you need to be aware that that is eliminating sources of fun for almost all players. Like some players will care less about that source of fun, and some players will care more. But I think my strong sense is that most people lie as a scatter plot across most of these four quadrants. It's just where they are currently most focused. And so the more your game is focused in one of these places or another, the less, the less rich and total your experience of playing your game is. And again, that's a valid design choice. I'm not saying it's not. I'm just saying that, like, the idea that there are players who care about competitive and that's bad, and there are players that care about narrative and that's good. That seems to me that this is a better framework for thinking about where the fun can emerge from.
Yeah, and I think it's a valid design choice to cut out one or another of those sections, but it's important to say that it's not a necessary design choice.
I don't think so.
Bringing everything together in your game is not like a cursed problem that cannot be achieved, and part of that is because of the way these games operate. I think the hobby part allows you to operate in these different areas. You can be like a hyper competitive player and get like a very social, non-diegetic sort of joy out of the painting and the modeling and the hobby that you do, that has nothing to do with the competitiveness of the way that you play. And you can bring these players together in all sorts of different ways.
And also the way that you implement these things will never be the same for every player. So, for example, I think that one of the reasons that Warhammer 40,000 is a good game in its modern implementation is that it hits a number of these, like, diegetic, intrinsic, building an army that feels like, I can read the fluff and I can build the army. It has these ways of sharing that narrative on the table, with the narrative scenarios, and we can have a shared sort of experience of the story. But for me, like, the experience of actually playing with the mechanics at the table, like, I don't get a lot of non-diegetic intrinsic pleasure from playing that game because I find the mechanics are not pleasurable to interact with. And so that game is lighting some things on the Christmas tree, but it's missing, for me. I'm particularly focused on, am I, for its own sake, enjoying the mechanics of manipulating this game system? And so for me, that game misses in a way that for another person who's just less bothered about the technology of a game, more forgiving of a clunky rule system, they're like, okay, fine, well, this is how the game works, we'll just play this game. And so it's also that, like, the way that your game lights up these things is an overlay on what a person is feeling that day, or what it is that they're looking for this month.
And where they are in their sort of gaming journey. I think there's
Right.
plenty of people for whom 40k is the first Minutes game they've ever played, where they appreciate the mechanics in a very non-diegetic
Right, yeah.
way.
Rolling dice is fun. No one can say it isn't. And if that's the way that you're getting to roll dice, then you are going to get some non-diegetic intrinsic fun from fistfuls of dice.
Yeah,
And it
just
won't be marred by the fact that you knew there were better ways.
and well, just if the first ever game that has said to you, bring anything you like to the tabletop, put it anywhere on the tabletop, have it exist in space, is 40k, then you're going to get a lot of non-diegetic enjoyment from the sheer mechanical loveliness of that very concept.
Yeah,
Maybe as you become more of a connoisseur of these things, you might see, but your
absolutely.
game is somewhere on somebody's journey through the hobby, and accepting that it's here as opposed to there is, again, like, relevant to how you write your game and you design
Yeah.
it and the rewards you give people.
So there are some other exciting frameworks in this opening section of our textbook, The Fundamentals of Tabletop miniatures game design. Particularly, there's this whole idea about dramatic focus that we won't go into today, but I think is kind of a fascinating way of thinking about why your game mechanics should exist and when you should take game mechanics out and how that relates to the actual fantasy that you're providing to the players. But we've probably talked for long enough and given away enough free information from our book, which of course you will now click the link in the description below and pre-order for free delivery to anywhere in the world. Thank you.
Absolutely. So there's there'll be a link in the down belows to Routledge's website where you can pre-order the book. Again, we'll say we did mention in the last video, order the paperback, not the hardback. The hardback is for universities and libraries, and is priced accordingly and unprettified accordingly.
Yeah, it doesn't have a lovely Sean Sutter illustration on the front of it.
Absolutely, you are not getting more for your money if you go with the hardback or order the paperback or the digital version. Well, I think they're basically the same price, but if you like a digital version, crack on with that. Also, swing by our Patreons and support us in writing and designing these things. Swing over to the Discord, have a chat with us about some of these sort of overview ideas that are in the first section of the book, and swing down to the comment sections. If you have opinions about sources of fun within a game, the definition that we've given of these being non-discrete miniatures games, please give us a comment, open up a discussion about that. I'd love to have a chat about it. We've spent a good few years thinking about it now, and hit on the like and subscribe while you're down there. But for now, I think from this episode, this Rule of Carnage is going to be a thank you and goodbye. So thank you and goodbye.
Bye-bye. Goodbye. Cheers.